Jonathan Ray continues his exploration of philosopher William Hazlitt's intellectual career by examining his original thinking on the nature of human identity. It led, Hazlitt believed, to his major metaphysical discovery.
In the summer of 1795, when William Hazlitt decided to break off his education at Hackney New College after only 2 years, everyone thought he'd gone mad. The once joyful country lad had become a sorry spectacle, sullen, slovenly, unkempt, taciturn and inarticulate, ignoring other people and shambling around with his eyes fixed on the ground. If he'd had any sense, he could have spent the next 3 years completing his course in very comfortable surroundings, within walking distance of London, under the guidance of sympathetic teachers who let him read and write more or less as he liked, while tolerating and even encouraging his angry political radicalism. But the 17-year-old Hazlitt had thrown it all over, and his chances of becoming a liberal dissenting minister like his father, or pursuing any other kind of professional career, were now in ruins. He entertained some hazy notion of living amongst artists and picking up the art of painting, but in the meantime he had to throw himself on the charity of his long-suffering parents, joining them in their poor little cottage in the Shropshire village of Wem, while they could only pray that their son would eventually come to his senses. One of his acquaintances thought Hazlitt must have left Hackney because he'd become an atheist, even an avowed infidel, but that seems quite unlikely. He never lost his respect for Christianity, at least in its primitive and rational form, and anyway the headmaster reported many instances of students at Hackney who had lost sight of religious principles without concluding that they ought to leave. And as far as Hazlitt himself was concerned, the main cause of his disaffection was the modern philosophy that pervaded the supposedly rational curriculum at Hackney, the philosophy of mind that attempted to reduce human experience as a whole to a network of associations of ideas in which, as he put it, one thing follows another without end or purpose, with no apparent connection or internal unity amongst them. If Hazlitt was indeed being assailed by religious difficulties, they arose, for him and for many of his contemporaries, not so much from the concept of God as from that of the soul. Most forms of Christianity, including those that pride themselves on their rationality, presuppose the soul as some kind of permanent kernel of individual human selfhood, present within each one of us from birth to bodily death, and, with luck, surviving unscathed into some kind of future life. But what exactly was this self or soul? And what sort of continuity linked up the different stages of its existence? Was it a substantial entity, or merely a notional one, or even, as the notorious David Hume had suggested, purely fictitious? After leaving Hackney, Hazlitt had to spend most of his time with his sister and parents in Wem, trying to sketch and paint and grappling with the philosophy of mind and the problems of selfishness and the self. There were no obvious signs of progress, but after a year he assured his father that he was at work on a philosophical treatise and that he had proceeded some little way in explaining the relations between virtue, selfhood, and what he called absolute self-interest. A few months later, however, Hazlitt made what he called a metaphysical discovery. He became convinced that there was something contradictory in the whole idea of the self as one thing. And if this discovery laid waste to the efforts of Hartley, Priestley and Godwin, and to modern philosophy as a whole, it also opened up astonishing new theoretical vistas, especially in the field of morality. Hazlitt had stumbled on his illumination more or less by chance. He had been reading a work of atheist propaganda called The System of Nature, recently translated from the French of the Baron d'Holbach. He found the book to be an unpleasant mixture of slender thought and heavy bombast, typically French in his opinion, but his attention was caught by a whimsical passage in which d'Holbach imagines a philosopher who dies as an implacable atheist and then wakes up to find himself resurrected as an immortal soul struggling to justify his former unbelief to a somewhat exasperated deity. It was, of course, a frivolous episode, but it reminded Hazlitt of a serious philosophical question, the problem of personal identity, as first formulated by John Locke at the end of the 17th century. Locke had wondered what it is that makes an old man, the same person as the boy he used to be. And he ended up suggesting that it all depended on a continuity of consciousness. The old man has memories of having been the child, and that's what makes him the same identical person. Your selfhood, for Locke, or who you really are, is therefore a function of who you remember having been in the past. But stop, Hazlitt said. There seemed to be a problem.
As I must be conscious of my past feelings to be myself, and as this conscious being will be myself, how if that consciousness should be transferred to some other being? How am I to know that I am not imposed on by a false claim of identity?
What could be meant by saying that someone could change out of all recognition and yet remain essentially the same person? The problem was hard enough in ordinary earthly life, when a beautiful youth declines into raddled old age, but it was even harder when it came to the idea of a soul that had become detached from its body. Why should the soul that was now pleading for God's understanding in heaven be identified with that of the atheist whose rotting corpse would soon be committed to the earth? The soul might think it used to be the atheist, but after all, it could have got it wrong. And what if there were several different souls, all imagining that they remembered the same atheistic past? Which would then be authentic and which an imposter? Or, setting aside the idea of a future life, what if two people happened to have exactly the same memories? Would they then be sharing in the same self, a single communal soul? Hazlitt would never forget the occasion when the problem of personal identity stole up on him and took possession of his mind.
There are moments in the life of a solitary thinker which are to him what the evening of some great victory is to the conqueror and hero. How little do they know, who have never done anything but repeat after others by rote, the pangs, the labour, the yearnings, the misgivings of mind it costs to get the germ of an original idea, to dig it out of the hidden recesses of thought and nature, and bring it half-ashamed, struggling and deformed into the day, to give words and intelligible symbols to that which was never imagined or expressed before.
The exhilaration of this private intellectual moment sustained Hazlitt through several more months in the obscure village of Wem. But early in the new year, there was a thrilling piece of news. The Unitarian chapel in nearby Shrewsbury was going to appoint a new minister, and the leading candidate for the post was a celebrated preacher and radical agitator who'd recently published a slim but remarkable volume called Poems on Various Subjects by S.T. Coleridge, late of Jesus College, Cambridge. It would seem that Hazlitt was already familiar with it, delighting not only in Coleridge's tone of conversational intimacy, but also in his explicit political radicalism. There were admiring references to revolution in America and France, a scheme for the abandonment of individual property, and a rapturous vision of earth reparadised. On top of that, Coleridge had seeded the volume with references to modern philosophy. It included eulogies to both Joseph Priestley and David Hartley, and extended reflections on the ambiguities of egotism, and most remarkable of all, a generous assessment of the anti-revolutionary philosopher Edmund Burke. In the early days of 1798, Sunday the 14th of January to be exact, Hazlitt got up before dawn to trudge 10 miles through mud and drizzle to the chapel in Shrewsbury High Street, where the prodigious preacher was to deliver a trial sermon. The prospect of a poet and philosopher getting up into a Unitarian pulpit, he said, was a romance in these degenerate days, perhaps even portending a revival of the spirit of primitive Christianity. Hazlitt got to the chapel with only a minute to spare and was astonished to find that the preacher looked about his own age, a florid young man with dark, disorderly hair, who crackled with a strange wildness as he announced his biblical text. And he went up into the mountain to pray, himself alone.
When he came to the last two words, which he pronounced loud, deep, and distinct, it seemed to me as if the sounds had echoed from the bottom of the human heart, and as if that prayer might have floated in solemn silence through the universe. The preacher then launched into his subject, like an eagle dallying with the wind. The sermon was upon peace and war, on the spirit of the world and the spirit of Christianity, not as the same, but as opposed to one another. He talked of those who had inscribed the cross of Christ on banners dripping with human gore. And to show the fatal effects of war, he drew a striking contrast between the simple shepherd boy piping to his flock as though he never should be old, and the same poor country lad crimped, kidnapped, made drunk at an alehouse, turned into a wretched drummer boy, with his hair sticking on end with powder and pomatum, and tricked out in the loathsome finery of the profession of blood. And for myself, I could not have been more delighted if I had heard the music of the spheres. Poetry and philosophy had met together. Truth and genius had embraced, under the eye and with the sanction of religion. I returned home well satisfied.
A couple of days later, Coleridge himself walked up to Wem to pay respects to Mr. Hazlitt, who, though he did not see much point in poetry, was in favour of anything that might give a fillip to the Unitarian cause. He marvelled at the ebullient loquacity of his visitor, and according to young William, who'd come down from his room to join them in the small panelled parlour, half hoping, half afraid, he could hardly have been more surprised or pleased if our visitor had worn wings.
I listened for a long time without uttering a word, but I did not suffer in his opinion by my silence. For those 2 hours, he was afterwards pleased to say, he was conversing with William Hazlitt's forehead. He talked very familiarly, but agreeably, and glanced over a variety of subjects. At dinner-time he grew more animated, and dilated in a very edifying manner on Mary Wollstonecraft and Burke. Burke was a metaphysician, and also an orator, almost a poet. On this I ventured to say that I'd always entertained a great opinion of Burke, and that speaking of him with contempt might be made the test of a vulgar democratical mind. This was the first observation I had ever made to Coleridge, and he said it was a very striking one.
Hazlitt may well have come to realise that his remark was pompous, pretentious, sycophantic, and too obviously prepared in advance, but it served its purpose, and Coleridge began to take a gratifying interest in him. For the first time in his life, he was able to imagine that his struggles with ideas might be of interest to other people, and all of a sudden, as he recalled, the leg of Welsh mutton and the turnips on the table had the finest flavour imaginable. Coleridge slept over in the Hazlitt's cottage in Wem that night, but at breakfast the next morning he received a letter offering him enough money to maintain himself as a philosophical poet, so he decided that he would not after all become a Unitarian minister in the neighbouring town. Hazlitt was beside himself. The angelic figure who had smiled on him the previous evening was about to desert him forever, to inhabit the hill of Parnassus, to be a shepherd on the delectable mountains. But before he set off, Hazlitt's Redeemer called for pen and ink and scribbled a note saying simply, "Mr. Coleridge, Netherstowey, Somersetshire." He handed it to the young man, saying it was only a few days' walk and he would be glad to receive a visit in a few weeks' time. Hazlitt returned to his struggles with modern philosophy with new vigour, taking massive walks with no company except a volume of Rousseau and his increasingly ragged copy of poems on various subjects. In those last weeks of winter, the Welsh valleys became the cradle of a new existence for him, he said, and he kept remembering that genius had smiled on him at last, and I was to visit Coleridge in the spring.
William Hazlitt, Philosopher, was presented by Jonathan Ray and produced by Gillian Hush. The reader was Russell Dixon, and it was a Square Dog radio production.